Welcome to another installment of Demolishing Arguments, our online Sunday school series. We're glad you're here. Last time we saw the sadness of Socrates, and as you may recall, he was sad because of the syllogism that his student Aristotle constructed that said all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, and therefore Socrates is a mortal. And we use that as an example of what we call a valid argument. It's set up in such a way that there's this category of men that's established and placed inside the category of mortals. Socrates is then said to belong to that category of men, and because he belongs to the category of men, it necessarily follows that he is a mortal. It's a valid argument. The conclusion has to come based on the way the argument is set up. So why were we doing this? Well, we said one of the things we wanted to be able to do is to obey a verse like 2 Corinthians 10:5, which says that we demolish arguments and that we take every thought captive to Christ. And if we're going to be able to demolish arguments and to take thoughts captive, we're going to have to know how to argue well, and so that we can create a good argument, but also so that we can assess the quality of other people's arguments. We also saw this verse from Romans 12:2, which instructs us to be transformed through the renewing of our mind, so that we have to think differently than we have before. So that's why we were in this series, and still reviewing from last time. We saw this invalid argument. All men are mortal. Starts out the same way, creates two categories, puts one aside the other. But the second premise says that Socrates is a mortal. It sticks Socrates in the category of mortals. Now it draws a conclusion that is true, but is not valid. It says that Socrates is a man. We know that to be true, but it's not a valid argument, because the problem is that the conclusion puts Socrates in this category of men, but we don't know that he is there. Nothing about the argument forces that assumption, forces that conclusion. And so this is an invalid argument. Now, we wanted to review real quickly here. What were some of we talked about critical thinking, the ability to take apart these arguments and to think about them well. And so let's review real quickly what are the elements of critical thinking. Skillful analysis, assessment, and reconstructing. Remember we said, and here was what we've been doing is reconstructing arguments, putting them together in a way that we can think about them and assess them and analyze them. We said that critical thinking, the goal should be that it's self-directed and self-monitored. We said that they were sent to rigorous standards. We want to hold ourselves to a high standard of thinking. And there was mindful command of the use of these things. The world is assaulting us all the time. We've got to have our brains on all the time and be thinking well. So let's review kind of where we left off last time. A valid argument. Remember, this was a valid argument. Teachers are wise, intelligent, handsome, and humble. It creates these categories. There they are. And it says that teachers fall into the intersection of all those other categories. So far, so good. Scott is a teacher. And because Scott's a teacher, that little gold dot, Scott necessarily falls within the other realms. And that's the conclusion of this argument. My battery must be dying. I apologize. Therefore, Scott is wise, intelligent, handsome, and humble. If he's in that category of teachers, and if teachers are within the intersection of all those other categories, then Scott must also be in the intersection of all those other categories. Now, we said this was a valid argument. The conclusion necessarily follows from the premises. Okay? If we have all these things set up this way, it's got to come out the way we said. But what's the problem? Is the conclusion necessarily true? The argument's valid, but is the conclusion necessarily true? The obvious answer is no. Not every Scott is someone who is wise and humble, intelligent, and handsome is the other one. How can I forget that one? So part of what we want to do tonight, today's lesson, is take a look at when good arguments go bad. Here we have a valid argument, but it comes to an untrue, or at least not a necessarily true, conclusion. So we're going to learn how to analyze arguments that are set up correctly. They're valid arguments, but they still lead to unreliable results. Let's take a look at why. So let's go back and analyze this argument. What's wrong with it? Well, obviously what's wrong with this one is that very first premise. The first premise is not true as stated. It simply is not true that all teachers are all of these things. We could have all of these categories, but isn't it possible to imagine that there would be groups of teachers that would fall elsewhere? Some who are intelligent and humble, some who are humble and wise, some who are none of these things. That first premise isn't true. It's what we call a false assumption. The premises of arguments are the things we build our arguments on. They're the assumptions, the starting points. Anytime we make an argument, we make a case for something, we're starting somewhere. That's our assumption. That's our premise from which we have jumped off. This argument has a false premise, or at least one that isn't necessarily true. And that's what led to its problem. So why does this matter? Well, here's an example of where this kind of false premise gets us into some trouble. So natural things are good. There are two categories. We got the category of natural. We got the category of all things good. Natural is inside of the good. Homosexuality is natural. It's in that category that we call natural, that gold circle there. Well, the logical, valid conclusion is therefore homosexuality is good. So is that a valid conclusion? Yes, it is. But is the conclusion true? And the answer is no, it's not. Why? Because of this false assumption problem. Just as not all teachers are handsome and humble and wise and intelligent, neither is it true that everything natural is good. Valid conclusions require good thinking. True conclusions also require true premises. We must begin from a true place if we're going to end up with a true conclusion. And our goal as Christians ought to be not just to construct valid arguments, but to arrive at true conclusions. And that means we have to begin with true premises. So what's the problem here? Natural things are good. You know, for the last 20, 25 years, a lot of Christians have been arguing the second premise. Homosexuality is natural. They've been arguing, no, it's not, no, it's not. I don't know. And the problem right now is nobody knows. We don't know whether it's natural or not. But that's beside the point. Set it aside. Imagine for a moment, let's grant that it is natural. Let's grant that it's controlled by genetics, by DNA, and that it is 100% natural. Doesn't matter. It's the first premise that's our problem. See, if we want our conclusion to come out of the Bible and be consistent with the Bible, then we've got to go to the Bible for our premises. And what we're going to find out is this premise isn't supported by the Bible. You say, well, Scott, natural things are good. Let's take a look at what the Bible has to say about some of that. I know that nothing good dwells in me. Sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery. You see, our natural state is a sinful state. Our natural state is a fallen, broken state. It's not true that all things that are natural are necessarily good. And so that premise is flawed. That's an example of why we've got to learn how to assess the premises, not just assess the argument. Is it valid? Are the categories lined up properly? Do things fall within the categories properly? That's important. We also then have to consider the premises. Are they true? Are they correct? Now, there are other examples of false assumption arguments. One of these is something we call the false dichotomy. Here's an example of a false dichotomy. You are either with me or you're against me. You're not acting like you're with me. Therefore, I'm going to conclude you must be against me. And we recognize that this is not a true argument, a true conclusion. It's a valid argument, but it starts with a false premise. It starts with this assumption that there are only two possible things, either with or against. It's completely possible that what I'm doing is something you don't care about one way or another. You're neither in favor of it or opposed to it. There's another possibility. You're unaware of it. There's a fourth possibility. There are all these other ways to assess this. It's not a simple, you're with me or you're against me. The arguer created a dichotomy. It's this or it's that. And that's called a false dichotomy. It doesn't have to work that way. We don't tend to talk in syllogisms in everyday lives, so the false dichotomy tends to show up as something we call the complex question. So here's kind of the classic example of the complex question. Have you stopped beating your wife? The question, kind of smile and giggle. The question is a complex question. It's called a complex question because it creates this false dichotomy. It's worded in such a way that there are really only two possibilities. You see, you can answer yes, which means I have stopped beating my wife, or you can say no, which means I haven't stopped beating my wife. And of course, that's a false dichotomy. It's not limited to those two categories. There is another possibility, and the other possibility is simply this. I never beat my wife. I couldn't have stopped because I never started. That's an example of a complex question. Let me give you another example of a complex question. Title at the top says false dichotomy, but complex question is a better way to say it here at this point. John 9:1. Real quick story about this. My sister, when we were teenagers, my sister had a very serious brain malady, and we thought for a time she might be dying, and it was a very difficult time. A lot of hospitalization. Spent a lot of time in the hospital. It was a rough time in our family. She's fine now, praise God. But this passage was what we were studying in the youth group at church, and I came upon this, and it's always stuck with me because it made me think about my sister's situation. So Jesus and his disciples are walking along, and they come upon a man born blind, and the disciples say to Jesus, "Who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" See how they frame the question? There's only two possibilities: either he sinned or his parents sinned. Anytime a question limits the number of possible responses, we ought to think about it, we ought to analyze and assess it and say, is this a complex question? Has it limited the number of choices in a way that leads to a conclusion that it may not be true? A false assumption is at play here, that there are only X number of possible answers. Well, how did Jesus respond to this? Jesus says, neither this man nor his parents sinned. Rather, he was born blind so that the work of God might be displayed in his life. He wasn't being punished. His parents weren't being punished. God had a plan for him. God wanted to show something. Same is true with Job, right? Job didn't do anything to deserve what happened to him. And it happened so that God's glory could be magnified. The disciples limited the question to two possibilities. Jesus threw it out and said, nope, I'm a better critical thinker than that. I'm going to show you at least one other possibility. So why do we have to be careful of false dichotomy and complex questions? Well, here's an example from a few years ago. There was all this debate about whether the Boy Scouts of America should admit openly gay scouts. And the debate fell along the lines of there were only two possibilities. Either we admit those who are openly gay, or they don't admit those who are openly gay. And if it's the second one, then you're discriminating, and you're discriminating. And the whole conversation, the whole nation, everybody who was involved in the conversation acted like there were really only two possible outcomes: that we would discriminate against gays, or we would admit those who are openly gay. We never thought about at least one other possibility. Wasn't it possible to simply not bring it up at all? There's plenty of fires to be made and tents to be put up and little old ladies to be helped across the street and Eagle Scout projects to be done. Why were you talking about your sexuality at all? How about this? Nobody talks about it. We're not going to know if you're gay because we're not going to know if you're straight because we're not going to talk about it because there's plenty to do with teenage boys that doesn't have to be about sex. There were other possibilities in this argument. And yet the discussion broke down along just two possible answers. It's a false dichotomy. It's a complex question. Now, do all dichotomous questions, are they all based on false assumptions? Of course not. Is she pregnant? It's a dichotomous question, yes or no. and it doesn't lead to a false assumption or a false conclusion. Now, frequently the false dichotomy is not framed as a syllogistic argument, nor is it framed as a complex question, but rather it'll come as an if-then statement. Things like this: if you love me, then you will do the following. Of course, the problem with that is pretty simple, that it's not necessarily true that love has to lead to that. If you love me, you'll help me commit suicide. No, that's not true. Because I love you, I will not help you commit suicide. There are other possible outcomes. An if-then statement, well, you have to examine it. Anytime you see an if-then statement, assess whether or not it really is limited to those two possibilities. Another example of this: if God is love, then why are there so many innocent people suffering in the world? Why does he allow it? If God is love, then he ought to behave. Boy, the assumptions in that are myriad. If God is love, then he ought to behave the way I think he ought to behave. He ought to behave the way I think love is defined. He ought to do this about that. And it limits God, and it limits the number of possible outcomes, and it's a false assumption argument, because it's not open to all the possibilities of who God is and what he's about. We must be careful of any argument structured as a question or an if-then statement that limits the number of possible outcomes, and assess them wisely and carefully. There are other, we're dealing in today's lesson with false assumptions. There are other assumption problems. So somebody says, hey, let's go to Taco Bell. And I say, nope, I don't want to go to Taco Bell. Why not? Well, the last time I went to Taco Bell, I got sick. And of course, the intelligent responder says, but that doesn't necessarily mean. This is a common false assumption argument. It's so common, it's so important, it goes by its Latin name: post hoc ergo propter hoc. After this, therefore because of this. And it assumes that because one thing followed another, then the second thing was caused by that first one. And that just simply is not true. In fact, frequently it is not true. The classic example of this, my personal favorite, is the full moon hospital. And they're going to swear that on a full moon, the emergency room is crazy. It's crazy busy, much more hectic than any other time. It simply isn't true. The studies have been done. Analysis has been done, and it simply isn't true. And you say, well, then how can it be that everybody thinks that way? Well, here's how it happens. Because they go out on their coffee break at 1:30 in the morning, and they're sitting there with their friends, and they're talking about, oh, what a crazy night tonight. We've had 2 women give birth. We had a stabbing. We had that car accident. It's been insane tonight. And they're sitting there and they're drinking their coffee and eating their sandwich, and somebody looks up and says, oh, the moon is full. Well, that explains it. And it connects those two things in their head, and it cements it. Now, 3 weeks later, if you know anything about the phases of the moon, it's a 4-week cycle. So 3 weeks later, they go out. It's crazy. We've had a pregnant woman. We've had a shooting. We've had a bus accident. We had somebody get burned in the local restaurant. It's been insane tonight. And they're eating their snacks and they're drinking their coffee, and nobody looks up and says, oh, it's a waning gibbous. Because that simply isn't how we work. And so when there are hectic, crazy nights that don't coincide with a full moon, nobody notices. So we cement in our head this idea that the moon controls these things. Why do I use that example? Because when we give God's glory over to the things he's created, we're in violation of the scriptures. As Christians, we need to be rigorous thinkers, because we cannot assign to the moon the control of events that belong to the creator of the moon. We cannot assign to our horoscope the power over our lives that belongs to the sovereign creator of the constellations. We must think rigorously, or we're going to fall into the trap of giving glory to the created things rather than the creator. Other reasons, why else do we have to be careful of this? Because it leads to all sorts of problems, interpersonal problems and problems within the church. You know, I told Ginny about my prayer request in complete confidence, and now everybody knows about it. Ginny's a blabbermouth. Well, maybe Ginny isn't. Maybe she didn't tell anybody. You didn't consider the other possibilities. Just because you told Ginny and then it got out to everybody, you see what you forgot there was that your mom didn't think that you wanted to keep it private. And so your mom put it on Facebook so people would be praying for you. And somebody in the church is connected to your mom's account, and now it got spread through the church because they care about you, they want to pray. And Ginny never said a word. When we don't think carefully, when we create these sorts of logical errors, post hoc ergo propter hoc, after, therefore, because of it, we are going to cause all kinds of problems in our churches and in our lives and in our interpersonal relationships. The one does not necessarily flow from the other just because they happened in sequence. So, quick review. A valid argument's conclusion necessarily follows from its premises. A valid argument's conclusion can still be false, even though it follows from its premises. Arguments based on false assumptions, false premises, are referred to as false assumption fallacies. So far, we've looked at common false assumptions that include, apologize for the batteries here, the false dichotomy. It's either this or that. That's not necessarily the case. The complex question asked in such a way that the number of possibilities are limited. The false if-then argument, and the false causation argument, the post hoc ergo propter hoc argument. Those are all examples of false assumption fallacies, arguments that they can be perfectly valid arguments that lead to untrue conclusions because they start from an untrue premise. Well, that's our lesson for this morning. Next week, we're going to take a look at another way that arguments can get themselves in trouble. We're going to look at circular reasoning and how and what to do about it, and how we can break out of that and be careful. With this little note, circular reasoning is unavoidable, and everybody does it. So we're going to have to look at that also, and it'll be an interesting discussion. Thanks for being a part of this.